You're watching the press preview. It's the first look at what is on the front pages. It's time to check out the headlines with the Deputy Editor of ConservativeHome, Henry Hill, and the Senior Associate Editor for the new Statesman, Rachel Cunliffe. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's take a look at some of those front pages before we chat to them, starting with the Metro remarking on the increasing number of letters of no confidence lodged against the Prime Minister by his fellow Tory MPs. Their headline, Boris may be toast. The Telegraph says Mr Johnson's own ethics advisor, Lord Geit, has asked for him to explain why he believes he hasn't broken the ministerial code. The Eye reports that the Prime Minister has been making phone calls to MPs in an effort to shore up support in a possible no-confidence vote. The Mirror goes with the Archbishop of Canterbury, suggesting Prince Andrew is trying to make amends and he should be forgiven after settling his sex abuse case. Here's your Guardian, focusing on the fact that criminal acts of violence at GP surgeries across the UK have almost doubled in 5 years as doctors' leaders warn of a perfect storm of soaring demand and staff shortages. The FT has word of a pact between the UK and the EU banning the insurance of ships carrying Russian oil, which effectively stops Russia's ability to export crude oil altogether. And don't forget, by scanning the QR code you can see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us discussing them. And I'm joined tonight by Henry Hill and Rachel Cunliffe. Great to see you both. Thanks for joining us. So, Rachel, perhaps we can start with the front page of the Metro. Their headline, pretty start for the Prime Minister, Boris may be toast. There are rumours that potentially all the letters required, those 54 letters, are already in. I mean, do you think it's a case of when as opposed to if?
Well, it's not going to be before the bank holiday Jubilee weekend. I think we can all count on that. But one thing that the Conservative Party really doesn't want is to overshadow those celebrations that you were reporting on just a moment ago, people camping outside Buckingham Palace. So we're not going to hear anything until next week. But yes, those who have been keeping a close eye on numbers now say that the ones that we know about, 30 letters, or at least 30 MPs who have spoken out, suggest that it's highly likely that we have hit 54 letters, and if we haven't hit them yet, we're going to hit them pretty soon, which I think is very interesting, because if I'd been on this show a week ago, we'd have been talking about the imminent publication of the Sue Gray report. If I'd been on Wednesday night, we'd have been talking about how the Sue Gray report was published and how the Prime Minister seemed to have got away with it, and without any dramatic interventions in Parliament. And the whole thing was a bit of a damp squib. And yet here we are, and according to the Metro, he's toast.
Yeah, Rachel, do you think it's interesting that, isn't it? I wonder why the delay from when Sue Gray published her report to now. Do you think many, including journalists, actually, some journalists, sort of misread the mood and thought that Boris Johnson was safer than maybe he is?
I think a couple of things may have happened. One of them is that Tory MPs went back to their constituencies at the end of last week and maybe faced some very angry constituents who asked what they were going to do about it. Obviously, they have been using the excuse up till now, we'll wait until the Met investigation is complete and we'll wait until Sue Gray report is published. They don't have either of those excuses anymore. So maybe they started to really feel the heat. I do also get the sense that this drip, drip, drip of letters of no confidence and interventions may well have been coordinated by Conservative MPs who want Johnson out, who maybe figured that they could get more mileage out of their letters if they kept the pressure on over a prolonged period of time, rather than sort of dramatically all saying it at once. But certainly we are in a very different position now than we were 6 days ago.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the language even seems to have changed a little bit tonight, Henry, doesn't it? Just looking at the front page of the Eye, they're claiming this is an exclusive, that the Prime Minister is phoning Tory MPs to save his job. And Sky News spoke to Nadine Dorries earlier on today, a huge supporter, of course, of Boris Johnson. And she wasn't talking in terms of the number of letters, but rather in the number of supporters that the Prime Minister would have if there is a vote. So a shift there in the language.
Yeah, absolutely. It does seem as though we are going to finally get the Tory leadership contest, which has been brewing, or at least a leadership challenge, which has been brewing for a while now. I don't think at this point journalists or commentators or observers could have been blamed for not thinking that Tory MPs would go through with it. They've been marching up and down this hill in ones and twos for months. There was this initial surge of interest when Partygate first broke. We thought that there was going to be a challenge then, but they backed down. Even really high-profile critics like Douglas Ross, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, very visibly reconciled and kissed the ring. And so it looked as if, based on the internal dynamics of the parliamentary party, the Prime Minister was going to hold on, even though, if you actually look at the polling for the government and his personal ratings, this story has clearly done huge damage. But it does seem that for a while now, we've had lots of unhappy Tory MPs in foxholes, maybe not coordinating, worried about going over the top. It does seem now as if they're starting to realise that there are enough of them and that they're going to go for it. They're going to go ahead and do it.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about the various different factions that are coming together and the fact that it isn't particularly coordinated, rather different to a very coordinated campaign by the ERG when it came to Theresa May and a vote of no confidence. Henry.
Absolutely. The dynamic is completely different. And part of the reason for that is because, especially since the collapse of Rishi Sunak, who until a few weeks ago was the Conservative Party's heir apparent and had by far the most developed leadership challenge machine, there simply isn't the machinery there pushing for Boris Johnson to go, because there's two stages, if you like, to this kind of instability. The first is when the various candidates start putting together, sounding out supporters, building up their network, putting their infrastructure in place, their shadow whipping operation and all the rest of it. But the second is when they go on the attack and they start telling their supporters to put letters in, try and encourage other people to put letters in. Now, I don't think even now, probably, but certainly not until very recently, that second stage hasn't been happening, which means that the Prime Minister has not faced a coordinated attack by one of his rivals, but merely dissatisfied MPs in dribs and drabs.
Let's have a look, Rachel, at the front page of the Daily Mail. They're going with rebels without a clue, saying that allies of the Prime Minister warned the plotters they could destroy the Conservative Party's best chance of winning the next election because Boris Johnson is a vote winner and there's no obvious successor.
Well, there's a lot going on there, isn't there? I mean, some people might say that the Conservative Party needs to lose an election. It's been in power for 12 years. It's ideologically drifting. It doesn't seem to know what it is or what it stands for. Is it the small state tax cutting pro-market party, or is it something much wider that's to do with levelling up? But then how do you do levelling up if you have to increase taxes? Are we global Britain? Are we closing our borders? Are we sending immigrants to Rwanda? There's a lot of confusion at the moment about what the Conservative Party is and what it stands for, partly because it has had various different leaders over that time and it's just a bit tired, and sometimes parties really do need a period of time outside government to really remember what it is that they stand for. But even if you are a Conservative and you don't think they need to lose the next election, and you'd really quite like to remain in power, you still have the question of whether Boris Johnson is the right leader to do that. And the polling is interesting here. I mean, that 2/3 of the British public think that he should resign over Partygate. There are a lot of Conservative MPs who are very worried about losing their seats, and crucially, they're not one type of Conservative MP. You've got Conservatives in the so-called blue wall in the traditional Tory heartlands who are worried about losing their seats to Liberal Democrats. You've got the red wall seats that Boris Johnson won. You know, he won in places of the country that no other Conservative leader could have done, but they're looking a little bit rocky now at the moment. And you've got two by-elections coming up on the 23rd of June, Brexit anniversary or referendum day anniversary, that represent those two extremes, one in Tiverton and Honiton, which is blue wall, one in Wakefield, which is red wall. And you're going to see playing out in action whether Boris Johnson really is the vote winner that his supporters, such as Nadine Dorries, claim that he is. OK, and I just want to bring in the front page of the Daily Telegraph, Henry, because there's another angle to all of this tonight. The ethics advisor, Lord Geit, who advises the Prime Minister, of course, he's brought out his annual report and he's saying there is a legitimate question about whether or not the Prime Minister broke the ministerial code when he was fined. It just adds to Boris Johnson's concerns, doesn't it?
It does. I think that there's an extent to which anyone who's actually deeply familiar with the ministerial code has to sort of bite their fists when it comes up in the press, because the ministerial code really is a guideline of expectations for ministers, and it is upheld by Boris Johnson. So the question of whether Boris Johnson broke the ministerial code constitutionally is somewhat irrelevant, but it would certainly be the case that if Lord Guy ruled that he did, it might encourage more Conservative MPs to go over the top, and it would encourage this pervasive sense now that this is a Downing Street operation, which is just falling apart. The Prime Minister cannot shake this story. Tory MPs have given him a lot of time. He simply cannot pivot away from it, and he's also not getting anything done. I think this is the other thing that is frustrating a lot of Tory MPs. You know, the diehards who rallied around Margaret Thatcher during that epic showdown at the end of her premiership. You know why they did that, whether or not you think they're right or wrong. She had a clear programme that they believed in, and they were prepared to go to the wall to defend it. I think the thing is, if you don't like Boris Johnson personally, what are you loyal to? What is the project that he's supposed to be delivering? He's backed off planning reform. Levelling up doesn't really mean anything. The war in Ukraine would tick along fine under any Prime Minister, basically. There's no obvious reason to keep him in post, and I think that's coming back to bite him.
And Henry, we're out of time, but I just want you to answer this in one sentence. You've got your finger on the pulse. If there is a vote, will he win it?
If they trickle over the line, I suspect he might win it. But if they go over with a big number, then perhaps not.
OK, interesting. Stay where you are, because coming up, could the chaos that we've seen at airports get even worse, and what might be done to stop it? We'll be chatting about that next. Welcome back. Part two of the press preview. Rachel, let's talk about the travel chaos that many are really suffering with this half-term holiday. And it's interesting, isn't it? The travel industry is blaming the government is blaming the industry.
The government is blaming the industry, although the government hasn't actually had very much to say about this up until now. It seems a bit delayed. I mean, where has Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary, been? Not sure. What seems to have happened is that airlines and airports and the aviation sector had to lay off a lot of people or made job cuts during the pandemic when no one was travelling, when no one was allowed to travel, and particularly when the travel rules were changing basically overnight with no warning whatsoever for either passengers or for the industry. Now the world is getting back to normal slowly. There's a huge amount of demand over Easter and again now over school half term and the Jubilee long weekend, and they don't have the people to bring back. So part of it is, well, you probably could have predicted that maybe during school holidays more people would like to go away. Like, seems kind of obvious. But part of it is also these are long-term challenges in the industry, partly as a result of the pandemic, partly, dare we say it, because of Brexit and a lot of European workers who went home. And the message from the industry and from unions that it's going to get worse before it gets better, sadly does seem to be the case, and there isn't really that much the government can do about it.
Yeah, really tough, isn't it? Especially for people who've not been able to have a foreign holiday for a couple of years, desperate to get away and now really struggling. Well, let's finish on some good news, shall we, Henry? Something to celebrate and cheer about. The Platinum Jubilee, a lovely double-page spread in the Metro. Get this party started. I think it's going to be fun, isn't it?
I think so. One of the nice things about the monarchy is that it's a very sort of non-partisan repository of sort of rituals, so which means that apart from about 20% of the population who are Republicans, most of the rest of us can just get on with things and enjoy a fun, short working week and long weekend. I, unfortunately, I suppose, am actually one of those desperate people who's watching the travel news very carefully because I'm flying out in the very early hours of Friday morning. But I'm sure that across the country, it's going to be a very enjoyable way to celebrate what has been an absolutely extraordinary life in public service for Her Majesty.
I hope there's no travel disruption for that RAF fly past on Thursday. That would be miserable, wouldn't it? Henry, Rachel, thank you both very much.